Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and welcome to yet another Asian Banker teleconsultation series. Today, we're very privileged to have with us a guest speaker who we will tap his thinking on the Euro crisis and then draw out certain implications for us in Asia. I've looked at the list of participants who have signed up, and it looks like a very good cross-section of people, including CEOs, including head of businesses, both corporate and retail, as well as some of you from the corporate planning divisions and so on. And it's also a very good cross-section of banks, very many regional banks, very many Asian banks who have regional exposure, and banks from as far out as Saudi Arabia and Mongolia and Korea and so on. So we do have a good cross section of people. Some housekeeping points during the session. If you have questions, please use the WebEx to type in your questions. I will look at your questions and then I will ask the questions either in sequence or in some form of logical format. The reason we're doing the questions by WebEx for you to type in is because in previous sessions we've had problems of background noise when different people are calling in from different locations. So we're trying to minimize that. At the same time, it helps with the flow of the conversation as well. Those of you who are new to the Asian Banker, you would be aware that, or rather, you probably have visited our website. You would know that we are a leading intelligence provider to the financial services community. Our core business is research, and these teleconsultation sessions are essentially designed for our research clients, as well as clients who interact with us in our benchmarking and data and analytics type of activities. At the same time, we keep track of global trends, and so sessions like this help to crystallize what's happening globally with what we need to know for our respective businesses. Today's session, we're very pleased to have Iain Anderson, who is a global public policy specialist, particularly in the financial services industry. He comes from the publishing industry, but also very connected with government in the UK and the Eurozone area. And he was part of the founding team at this organization called Cicero, which focuses on public policy and corporate communication strategies in Europe and now North America as well. When I met Iain, I tried to persuade him that he's more like a advocacy group rather than just a consulting company. I think I'll leave it with him to tell us a little bit more about Cicero and put us in context, and then get right into the presentation. But before I hand it over to Iain, I just need to let you know as well that the presentation will be available on the Asian Banker website. We want all of you to get used to our website and also register, even if you're not a subscriber. Some material on our website is free for 10 days. Even if you're not a subscriber, and some of our more valuable stuff is available to subscribers. At the same time, we want you to visit our website regularly to see our input into the current developments in the industry. So register as a normal visitor, and then you will be able to download the presentation. The researchers will be putting together a synopsis of the discussion, so that will be available online as well. So without wasting any more time, I'll give the next 15 to 20 minutes to Iain, and then we will get right into the conversation from there. So Iain.
Emmanuel, thank you very much indeed, good morning, good afternoon from London. Um, I think this couldn't be a better opportunity to have this conversation about the Eurozone crisis and the implications for Asia, not least because all eyes are focused on Brussels today here in Europe. Well, they're focused both on Brussels and on Madrid. Firstly, this morning we're expecting to see the launch of the European Commission's crisis management paper on bank resolution, and I'll be talking a little bit about that as we go through the teleconference. And then secondly, clearly, given what's been happening in Spain over the past few days, if you like, the agenda has moved from Greece to Spain in terms of European policymaker focus. And actually, I'm going later today to the IIF, the International Institute of Finance's conference in Copenhagen for the next 2 days, where we're expecting to hear a considerable conversation about just what next for Spain in the context of the Eurozone. But if I can move to the first slides, if you like, the content slides for this presentation, and just give you an overview of what I'm planning to discuss over the next 10-15 minutes or so. So firstly, as Emmanuel says, just a very brief introduction to Cicero, tell you a little bit about what we do, talk about the financial crisis and where we are right now. This debate that you'll be reading a lot about in terms of whether or not the policy focus is on growth or austerity, or a mix of both, and trying to disentangle exactly where that policy debate's got to. Look at the political response that we've seen to the crisis so far, and I think bring that right up to date with what we're expecting to hear today, again from the European Commission on bank resolution. Look at the global policy response as well, and then, as Emmanuel said, I think we'll get into a wider conversation about what this means for Asian banks when we get into the Q&A. So if we can go to the next slide, just very, very briefly, a little bit about Cicero Consulting. We're an international public policy business that has now a global footprint in Singapore, London, Brussels, and Washington, and that global footprint really has been built through the crisis and the desire of, in particular, the global systemically important institutions, the G-SIFIs, which is really the core of our client base, to try and decode exactly what is taking place across public policy debates in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. And it's really the core of what we do. We work across banking, insurance, and asset management, but given the preeminence, the importance of the banking debate right now, that is a large part of our work, and that work is advocacy as well as decoding what is going on. So supporting institutions to talk to government, to talk to the regulatory institutions, and when I'm in Asia and when I'm in the States, the understanding and the desire to look into Brussels and what's taking place within the Eurozone, as you can imagine, has just been growing and growing. So into that debate on where we are now, which is the next slide, and just giving you a sense of really what's been taking place in Europe over the past few months. Well, the victory of Francois Hollande as French president has significantly changed the debates and the dialogue. The Merkozy Pact between Merkel and Sarkozy before the French election was setting us on a trajectory which has changed, I think, significantly since the French elections. And I want to talk in some depth about quite what I think that means for policy around the banking sector. The Greek situation continues, and well, we now have Greek borrowing costs at today. I was just looking, I think 28.6%. You know, you compare that with German borrowing costs of 1.24. The spreads have never been higher, and they remain high, and I think they are going to continue to stay in that place over the next few months. But a loss of market confidence around Greece, which continues, and frankly, the only thing that is taking the focus away from Greece right now is the immediate and absolute focus on Spain and Italy in particular. Spanish spread between the Spanish 10-year bond and the German 10-year bond is now at 5 points, 6.23 this morning on Spanish bonds. Again, a very precarious situation to the extent that the Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy has effectively been saying to markets in Europe today that Spain is almost unable to borrow, and I think that focus on Spain and policy there set to completely overshadow the European Commission's plans for the launch of its paper on bank resolution today. A significant change in the Franco-German discourse. The quality and the nature of the dialogue between Hollande and Merkel so far not particularly good, and I think that is and remains crucial dialogue within Europe, and many of us remain deeply concerned as to quite how that's going to evolve. The challenge in Europe remains the rise of both the left and the right, who are increasingly in their politics less wedded to the European project, and are gaining popular legitimacy at a time when the centre of Europe and policymakers there appear to be focused on the technical aspects of reform rather than the impacts, shall we say, on real voters, and you can't discount that. An implicit referendum on the direction of EU policy, I think that's one to look out for over the next few months, as the fiscal compact that was agreed in December last year, it continues to be ratified or not. But one bright spot at the end of last week, Irish voters backed the fiscal treaty by about 60 to 40. However, if you look at the quality of the discourse within Ireland, a lot of that was essentially about no choice whatsoever. The Irish people may be deeply unhappy with the austerity that they're going through, but like Greece, they see no other options right now. So if we go to the next slide and unpack a little bit more of the trade-off between growth and austerity, I think there's a significant impact in terms of that debate right now. The need to tackle deficits within the Eurozone, well, you can see in terms of the size of the figures right now, that remains highly significant. And the policy response which we see from Europe remains in transition. As I mentioned, when we look at the election of François Hollande in France, the fiscal compact agreed at the end of 2011, well, he now wants a compact on growth, and he's continuing to focus on that. And when we get to the next major European summit at the end of June, that will be his primary desire. The European Stability Mechanism and its related European Financial Stability Fund, again, we're going to hear some more of the direction of travel on that towards the end of the month, and indeed some more from Brussels today on that question, and the question of national bailouts, and whether or not actually it's Frankfurt that is the master of Europe's destiny, and Berlin right now remains very, very much at the core of the political and the news agenda right now. So if we move to the next slide, we can just briefly look at what's taking place in Greece, probably the next significant political event over the next few weeks. And at the moment, Syriza, the new party of the left, which has replaced PASOK, the former coalition partner of New Democracy, it's Syriza that is out in front. At the moment, the leader of Syriza, Alex Tsipras, looks like being, on June the 17th, Greece's next prime minister, if he can get enough headway and form a coalition. That remains a big if. As we look at the elections in Greece last month, we have a patchwork of Greek parties that are available to Greek voters. Just over the past few days, the leader of Syriza has been gaining further in the opinion polls, and the essence of Greek policies look like heading almost in two directions. Firstly, the absolute desire of all the main parties to remain within the Eurozone, to not pull out of the Euro, but equally to suspend monthly interest payments to the European bailouts, and to delay around 11 billion euros worth of fresh cuts in austerity, which were agreed by the previous coalition government of New Democracy and PASOK. So it seems as if when we get to June the 17th, we may get greater clarity in terms of actually having a Greek government in place, but I don't think Germany or Brussels or core Europe is necessarily going to be happy with that policy response. If we go to the next slide, I really can't overestimate the importance of the change of power from Sarkozy to Hollande. It is significantly changed the dynamic of the European conversation. The Franco-German conversation remains the most important conversation within Europe and within the context of the debate on the Eurozone. And as I said earlier, François Hollande has changed that narrative towards growth and not just austerity. He is in direct opposition to Angela Merkel on the issue of the creation of Eurobonds. I think that's going to be a significant test of that relationship when we get to the summit at the end of June. Hollande faces his first electoral test both this weekend, when we have the first round of French National Assembly elections, and then the final round the following weekend on the 17th of June. But everything is pointing towards his policy being further endorsed by French voters, and the Parti Socialiste being favoured compared to the UMP, the party of former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. So if we move to that next slide and look at the forthcoming milestones over the next month. Well, the Irish referendum I talked about earlier, we've just seen those results, a rather grudging vote for further austerity in the fiscal compact. The French national elections, as I say, expected to continue to consolidate Francois Hollande's position. The Greek parliamentary elections, the election most probably of Cicero in a coalition with others, but with their leader as Prime Minister. The G20 pushing forward on financial reform at the in the middle of the month. There is a mini summit on the 22nd of June. I think that, given what's happening in Spain at the moment, I think that's an incredibly important pre-main summit meeting on the 22nd of June. Watch out for that, because that's Germany, France, Spain, and Italy getting together. I think that's where we're going to see whether or not there is the possibility to create some form of Eurobond mechanism or not. Hollande, Merkel may stand out completely against that idea. I expect her to do so. And then on the 28th, 29th of June, just at the end of this month, the full package in terms of banking reform laid out at that summit by internal markets, and we're expecting that package to include more detail on a recapitalization fund, more detail on a pan-European deposit insurance scheme, and further measures on resolution. So we move to the next slide.
You need to move a little bit faster, because but you're all good stuff so far. Please continue.
Yeah, I'm literally going to be finished in about 3 minutes.
No, you've got good stuff in there, but just if you could just go through all of your slides, but a little bit faster. That'll give us more time to have a conversation. Yeah.
Will do. So just finishing off really the global policy priorities. Essentially, what Europe is doing on its plans for bank resolution is essentially the end game of what was rolled out back in London at the G20 back in 2009, and the bank capital and resolution regimes. We're seeing those particular ideas roll forward with greater speed in the last 2 or 3 months. Just to briefly summarize what we're expecting later this morning in Europe from the European Commission. It's as a crisis management paper on bank resolution to minimize as much as possible taxpayer liabilities, early intervention measures before a bank gets into a critical situation, tools for national authorities and the new European Banking Authority for procedures controversial, obviously, including those bail-in procedures. Funds to be raised to finance resolution, for example, issuing guarantees or short-term loans, and I think it's a lot of that we will see debated hotly at the end of this month. Clearly, a lot of these priorities have been pushed and buffeted back and forward. Go to the next slide. You can see just how busy and active the European policy debate has been in terms of the macro and fiscal changes, the macro-prudential changes, and the micro supervisory conduct of business activity. The overall point I really want to make about this slide is that so much of Europe's agenda has been buffeted back and forward because of the ongoing Eurozone crisis, and you can't discount that. You can't discount the impact of that on the ability of policymakers to be able to move forward quickly. Finally, really, next slide, just a quick reminder of the institutional changes that are still very much bedding down at a European level. It's only really since the start of 2011 that we've had the three new regulatory bodies in place: EBA, EIOPA, and ESMA. It's fair to say that as the Eurozone crisis has been unfolding, these bodies have only really been actually finding their feet. I think there remain considerable bandwidth questions as to whether or not they're actually able to cope with the level of change right now. And then the final slide, which I think Emmanuel probably just takes us into our discussion to some extent, why should Asia care about all of this? Well, when I met Emmanuel the other week in Singapore, I'd come off a plane on the Sunday to the results of the Greek and the French elections, and I think this point still remains absolutely true, that the European Union still remains the largest economy in the world, and I think the conversation about the impact on Asia as to whether or not Europe can get its act together remains as redolent now as it was a month ago. So that's pretty much it, and I'll hand back now to Emmanuel, and we'll probably get into the questions.
Okay. So Iain, thank you very much for that nice overview, and especially for those of us who know there's so much happening, and yet we need to frame our own thinking in terms of what it means to us in Asia. There are two sort of lines of conversation that needs to happen between now and the end of this session. On the one hand, if I look at the name list of the people who are calling in right now, some of us come from institutions who have got credit lines with European banks. Some of us come from institutions where trade finance is a big area in which we have a lot of counterparty arrangements with European banks, and so we want to have a sense of where, especially the leading European banks that do business in Asia, where they are right now and what are they looking like. Another line of conversation is really greater clarification or clarity in terms of where the euro crisis is heading. I guess the penultimate question to ask is like, will the euro survive in itself? And if so, what sort of shape it will take? But that's a very big question. But there are some practical points, like how are the French banks going to respond to Hollandaise expansionary budget, for example. Where is he going to get the money from, and how's the banking industry going to support that? And you're going to be going to the IIF meeting today. Really, the IIF as an organization has been somewhat of a lobbying point for European banks to plead to keep to the deal in terms of the exposure to European debt. And I think they've been fighting a losing battle, and the regulators have been encroaching into their loan books and forcing them to take on bigger haircuts than they should. They would like to. But let's just start with on the bank side, on the side of where the people listening into this conversation would probably like to have answers on. And please, everybody, if you have questions, you can write them down, and we can read them on the screen, and then I'll ask the questions. But three categories of banks: the Spanish banks, the UK banks, and the German banks. How are they going to fare out? I mean, let's look at Spain, for example. You've got the strong Spanish banks, Banco Santander, Bilbao, for example, and then you've got the very weak, the Casas, the credit cooperative type institutions. How do you think the stronger European banks, particularly those in Spain, I'm quite interested, especially, are going to play out going forward, or how are they distinguishing themselves from the weaker banks?
Well, let's kind of just take Spain first. I think you're absolutely right to point to the difference between the Santander, the BBVAs of this world, and the who have a global exposure. They are G-SIFIs in their own right, and the domestically focused institutions. It's quite interesting, though, Emmanuel, frankly, how the Spanish government is playing that conversation right now in terms of the in terms of the demands that they're placing on Europe right now, and the way in which Rajoy is playing that conversation, I'm afraid, does not disaggregate the difference between those entities that have international exposure and those that are entirely domestically focused. Now, I think to some extent, and this almost, in a way leads on to your wider question about, where are European banks generally. I think if we get to a situation at the end of June where there is a detailed plan on the table for European banking integration, I mean, to some extent, Europe no longer has Spanish banks or German banks. The UK is a different situation, obviously, because it's outside the Eurozone. But actually, we just have European banks that happen to be located in various territories. I think that the nature of this debate is going to change significantly. But no, practically, is there a difference between those G-SIFIs and the domestic institutions? Yeah, absolutely there is.
Now, what about the banks in the UK? Now, I'm segregating them into three categories, and interestingly, they sort of neatly go into countries as well. So for Spain, I could call on Santander, Bilbao, BBVA as being strong banks as opposed to the rest of the country's story, which is weak. In the UK, you've got Lloyds, Barclays, RBS, all two of which are technically state-owned at the moment. Now, how are they going to? Well, I guess in your presentation you missed out the UK and how the UK is playing the euro crisis and what are some of the issues for the UK. and the role that the banks can be expected to play in the near term. So how international are they going to be, and how domestically focused are they going to be? What are the most important domestic agendas?
Okay. I mean, I deliberately didn't talk about UK banks. Sort of sat here in London, looking in, if you like, on the euro crisis. I think it's probably better that I didn't, in terms of the levers of control on the eurozone right now. Okay, I suppose two or three points to that. The British government's veto to the fiscal compact at the end of December 2011, the impact of that continues to reverberate quite significantly in policy-making circles in Brussels. On the one hand, a lot of institutions said very publicly, British institutions, banks included, after the UK Prime Minister David Cameron's veto at the end of in December last year, said, "Well done, Prime Minister. You know, well done for putting that firewall up between the UK and the rest of Europe." But actually, practically, under their breath, a lot of the same CEOs were saying some very different things to me. They're very concerned about the UK being isolated in the decision-making process on European policy. And I think this remains the concern, Emmanuel, as to whether or not the UK has the ability to be at the table and influence the outcome of a debate on a European resolution mechanism, a debate on a pan-European deposit guarantee insurance scheme. I mean, the biggest game in town outside the Eurozone crisis in the UK remains the rollout of the Vickers proposals. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to look at those, essentially it's a plan to create a firewall, not Glass-Steagall, but to create a firewall between the retail and the wholesale piece. The UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, in a speech he's giving on the 14th of June, so that's the date to look out for in the UK, the 14th of June will give the UK government's detailed proposals in the launch of his banking reform bill. Now, clearly that banking reform bill has significant impacts, perhaps more on HSBC and Barclays than it does on RBS and Lloyds Banking Group. So the big domestic agenda in the UK remain the Vickers proposals. The final point on
what is your sense of the likelihood of it going towards a ring fencing model? I mean, the Vickers proposal already, puts in place the ring fencing, the local retail business from the global business. But how far do you think the sentiments, at least right now, or is there clarity in terms of where it's heading? Whether there will be a need for banks to reincorporate an international business, for example?
Yeah, well, that is the way that the policy is heading. But remember, in the UK, we have a coalition government, seems to be the flavour of day in Europe at the moment, between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. There is considerable debate on this issue within the context of the coalition government. And actually, there is the sign, and I've written about this before, Emmanuel, there is a sign of a significant difference between David Cameron, the Prime Minister, and his Conservative Chancellor, George Osborne. So the coalition plans to lock these proposals in place before 2015 for implementation before the end of the decade. I would say for any market watcher, continue to watch this space. I think this is a very, very fluid situation as to whether or not the full ring fencing, as proposed by Vickers, actually takes place.
Mm. And then the German banks, the Deutsches and the Deutsche, is taking the brunt of the haircuts at the moment, and then you have the regional banks, which traditionally have been very strong liability. I mean, liability as in deposit saving banks. Their business in Asia appear to be running on its own steam at the moment. But what's the business of the German banks looking like in Europe right now?
Well, I mean, what we have seen, again, sort of viewed out of London, is not a flight is the wrong word, but certainly business over the past 3 or 4 months moving to London out of Germany. I think that is a trend that you'll certainly see in terms of reporting later in the year. I think there is a sort of parallel here to what we were discussing with Spain, in that at the end of this month, if the conversation about a European banking union continues to gather momentum, I think you do see that difference between the more domestically focused banks and the international entities. However, just despite the kind of noises and policy pronouncements that Angela Merkel has been making, firmly resisting any form of Eurobonds, the debate remains very, very active within the German banking community right now as to whether or not EU bonds, Eurozone bonds, may actually be helpful and supportive of not just Spain, not just Italy, but actually the domestic German banking system as well, because of the spillover effects from peripheral Europe. So that debate is pretty active there as well. But I would say the headline is certainly on the wholesale side, business flowing from Frankfurt to London over the past few months.
Now, if there is a Eurobond, how big do you think it needs to be meaningful?
Well, I mean, there are a whole number of scenarios and figures that are being touted on this one at the moment. I mean, the number that in terms of the stability facility, and therefore the reference back to the creation of a Eurobond, the number that keeps being talked about is upwards of 1 trillion euros in terms of that market impact effect. If you think about where the EFSF is, it's currently at 440 billion euros. So the idea essentially to try and get significantly ahead of the crisis by having sufficient headroom. But it's that kind of number that's being mentioned.
Okay. Now, China and India. How's the China and India story being read in Europe at the moment? I think that the news coming out of China, the manufacturing data, is very clearly pointing to a softening of the marketplace for sure. And India, is fiscally at the moment dysfunctional because of the cost of importing energy and so on, and inflation actually. So the idea that there would be growth in 2 other larger parts of the world, I mean large parts of the world, is now has to be sort of modified to be taken into account in terms of where growth is going to come from. So how's Europe reading China and India at the moment?
There is so much oxygen at the minute, Emmanuel, that obviously the core European conversation is taking, both in terms of news interest and policymaker bandwidth, that you can't help but feel sometimes, sat here in London, that the only thing that's going on in the world is the Eurozone crisis. That said, when you see slipping growth numbers out of China, when you see the concerns about the spillover effects from Europe in terms of both China and India, that news still does make front page headlines here in Europe, despite all the other political and economic pressures right now. So, is it getting attention? Yes, it is. Is it getting perhaps the kind of attention that it would have done without the extraordinary levels of stress around policy right now here in Europe? Probably not, but it's still getting significant attention.
France, in Ireland, in Spain. Now, at which point do you think the expansionist policies are going to start kicking in? And actually, I noted that the German banks have started, or rather, the rating agencies have started downgrading the U.S. subsidiary of German banks now. And the French banks were last downgraded in January, I think, in December-January period, and with the new Hollandaise government, it's a matter of time before it becomes clear as to what would be expected of the banks. At which point do you think that the politicians' expansionist policy is going to start kicking in? 2 weeks, 1 month, 6 months?
Yeah, well, I mean, a huge part of the growth part of this conversation and the expansionary part of this conversation is, of course, related to something that all of the banks are deeply involved in, and that is where policy goes on infrastructure developments. And you've even heard David Cameron talk about project bonds here in the UK. And actually, when we get to the summit at the end of June, there's going to be from Holland a huge focus on a growth pact, as I mentioned before. With it, the core of that growth pact is the infrastructure conversation. Now, to move quickly and to have some sort of impact on growth, the big focus needs to be on what are called, quote unquote, shovel-ready projects that can literally get moving within the next year, 18 months. Now, my concern about that, Emmanuel, is talking to those both in the banking sector but also in the corporate advisory sector around infrastructure, tell me that the number of shovel-ready projects ready to go is actually relatively small. And so I think, with that in mind, the ability to turn around the European economy quickly by giving some sort of stimulus to infrastructure spend in particular, I think remains very, very difficult to do. That said, it's going to be a huge focus of the conversation at the end of the month.
Right. What's the savings rate in Europe looking like, and also what's the the ability of governments to to run a surplus budget as opposed to a deficit budget? I mean, which governments do you think are closer to that than others?
On the savings rate, it kind of rather it does kind of rather depend on territory, and I think actually this is quite a good example of just how the desire for a single policy solution within a Eurozone territory and the reality of what's taking place on the ground varies significantly. Certainly in the UK, we've been seeing the savings rate after rising, it's kind of continuing to fall. In Germany, remains quite high. I think what I'd probably do though is I don't have the exact numbers to hand here at the moment, but we can probably follow through with the audience for some detailed numbers on that. From a surplus perspective, then certainly Germany still remains best able to weather the storm. It's the periphery and Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Ireland that still remain in the most difficult positions. That said, Ireland is doing a lot of focus remains, a lot of commentary remains on Ireland in terms of its ability to clean up the mess faster than other territories. But on the savings rate, we can probably provide some more information.
Okay. Just one last question, actually. Now that you mentioned the ability of Ireland to sort of clean up the mess faster, doesn't or will not Europe learn from Iceland? Because I think Iceland did an outstanding job in letting the failing institutions fail and getting their making sure that the taxpayer is not bailing out some of the failures and then keeping the budgets constrained and then coming up very quickly.
I think, I agree with you. I think Iceland does remain a kind of good example of not quite a V shape, but certainly an attempt to get to grips with the economics, and I think we're seeing that effect on the politics pretty quickly as well. But there are not many people, I would say, Emmanuel, looking. There are not many people in Europe looking at Iceland as a model, particularly strongly at the moment. I think that's partly because of the pressures of what's happening on a pan-European basis. We've kind of moved on. I think they're probably more likely to be looking, as I say, at the Irish example. It's certainly quoted a lot here in London, but it's also quoted a lot, I think, in Brussels about, in comparison with Greece and in comparison with some of those other territories. But it's a very good point.
Okay. So we'll conclude the conversation at this point. I just want to absorb all that you've told us. You're speaking from a European perspective, but we have to contextualize it for what we need to know for our decision making in this part of the world. I guess from your presentation and the conversation, the first thing that we need to be mindful of is are the time milestones and the timelines that you presented to us. But I will add to those timelines that we should look out for the implementation details of the Vickers proposal in the UK, the resolution of the failing banks regulation, the EU's attempt at regulating how banks fail, which will be, when will that be, you think? Is there a deadline for that one? The banking union thing in the
Yes, I mean, we're as I say, this morning Brussels will be issuing its full paper. And the summit on the 28th of June will, I think, build on that in terms of a plan.
Okay, so that's the 28th of June.
Definitely.
We'll look out for that. Also, the rating agencies' treatment of French and German banks. I think today or this week, the German banks have started being affected by the rating agencies. The French banks would come under another round of rating guidelines once the government policies kick in. And all of that will affect, trade, credit lines in Asia, and also bank strategies. Final question, actually, just by way of conclusion. Do you think there's a chance that HSBC and Stanchart might want to reincorporate or move out at least some of its incorporation out of the UK to Asia? They've been threatening that for a while now, but what do you think is the likelihood of that?
Both entities have been talked about in that regard. There's absolutely no doubt. But just very recently, HSBC, certainly here in London, gave a real sense that it had no immediate plans to move domicile. Standard Chartered have been much more exercised by the Vickers proposals. So I think the answer to your question can only really finally be made, or a clue to it, Emmanuel, can be made when we see George Osborne, the UK Chancellor, launch his final proposals for banking reform later this month. I think we will we'll see more of that at that point.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a moot point really, but they keep threatening to do that, and from what you're saying to us, I think they'll still use that as a boogeyman sort of thing to make sure that the regulations work in their favor. So those are essentially the key points that we'd like to take away from this conversation, and so we'd like to thank you for giving us an update on how Asian banks should look at the euro crisis. There's so much happening, but I think we need to keep our eyes on a few of the parameters so that we know how to draw a dotted line back to our respective businesses. So, ladies and gentlemen, the write-up on this session will be on our website. Iain's slides will be on our website, and we'd like you to fill in a feedback form as well. Jerome, who organized the administration of this teleconsultation, will ask you for the feedback by email. Thank you, Iain.